Growing tensions between world powers pressured countries to develop a system of rival nations as well as alliances. Germany, specifically, was jealous of Great Britain's navy and wanted to gain prestige among the world powers. Germany allied with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire to form the Central Powers. On the other side was the US, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, who formed the Allied powers. The US was in no shape to fight in modern warfare, as they had no standing army, no formal training, and no plan of strategy. From years, President Woodrow Wilson built up the army using Liberty bonds, and it soon became sufficient enough to fight the new modern style of war. War rations were given out to soldiers, which determined how much food they would receive. Many Americans were unsupportive of the war and wanted to remain neutral. However, the U.S. needed to fight the war to gain world prestige and imposed censorship judgment against those who publicly protested the Great War with the Sedition Act of 1918 and the Espionage Act of 1917. Tanks were revolutionary in the 1900s because it replaced horses and preceded the world into the era of modern warfare. With one country having developed tanks, competition began and everyone created their own variation of the tank. The British tank dominated the battlefield, and in the Battle of Cambrai, even though most of the tanks had been downed or malfunctioned, one-third managed to pass through German defense. Tanks were rarely used, because the tank strategy was premature at the time. However, U.S. tanks were the smallest, whereas German tanks were big and bulky, impractical for rough terrain. Russian tanks were oddly shaped and also impractical. Machine guns were revolutionary because they could mow down waves of soldiers and was responsible for 20% of all deaths in the war. The effect of the U.S. in World War I was significant. The U.S. heavily supplied the Allied forces with supplies and firepower and led the war to a turning point. America entered because Germany did not abide by the Sussex Pledge and would not cease submarine warfare and the use of the Zimmermann Notes to try forming an alliance with Mexico's Pancho Villa after the Mexican Revolution of 1910. The Germans had also sunk the RSS Lusitania of Britain prior. Using propaganda about the sinking of the USS Maine, the government drafted men into the army using the Selective Service Act, whereas women would work as nurses, clerks, and for volunteer organizations. Edward Isaac was posted on the USS President Lincoln when a German sub sank it and captured him as a POW. He received the Medal of Honor for gathering intelligence on the Germans and ended up escaping the prison. America's entrance was extremely successful due to the National Defense Act that established necessary funding for the war, which helped develop the U.S. Army. In northern France from July 1 through November 18, 1916, British and French forces were fought Germans in trench warfare near the River of Somme. During the Somme offensive, the goal was for the Allies to gain minor territories, relieve the French army fighting elsewhere, and to weaken the German army. This resulted in the most bloody battle in World War I, due partly to poor Allied leadership and a stubborn German defense. This was also the same time as the Black Tom explosion, where Germans blew up $20 million worth of U.S. ammunition. From November 20 to December 6 in 1917, the British launched an offensive called the Battle of Cambrai against the Germans in France. The importance of the battle demonstrated the power of tanks, since it was the first battle that was fought using large-scale tank warfare. The British dominated and brought in new strategies for warfare. During this time, Russia was going through its Russian Revolution, trying to abolish monarchy, and formed the Soviet Union with Vladimir Lenin as its leader. Also known as the Fourth Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Lys was fought by the Germans from April 9 to the 29th in 1918. The Germans' goal was to cut in between the French and British forces, separating the supply line. Taking place in Belgium, the British defended against the German attack and led the Allied powers to victory. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was a major part of the final Allied offensives. From September 26 until November 11, 1918, the battle was fought by the American Expeditionary Forces led by John J. Pershing against the Germans along the western front of France. American forces had to push along hilly terrain to completely divide German forces. Even though they had the disadvantage, the Americans won against the Germans. At the end of the offensive, the 77th Division, or the Lost Battalion, had been cut off and surrounded by German forces in the Argonne Forest, where after 6 days of desperate fighting, were rescued by the 442nd Combat Team. Alvin York received the Medal of Honor for leading troops to take over an enemy machine gun, killing 25 Germans and marching back with 137 prisoners. Social changes in America occurred during and after the war. Women went from being housemaids to gaining jobs in positions vacated by men during the war. Tens of thousands of women worked in fields and farms to free men for their service. Due to the demand and war effort, even new jobs were created mainly for women. For example, ammunition factories. In 1915, the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association created a poll that would have allowed women the right to vote. This finally came into effect after the war ended in 1918. So, African Americans were socially emphasized as well. They believed that by fighting, they could prove once and for all that blacks were equal to whites and deserved equal treatment. Henry Johnson was a soldier of the 1st African American Forces, awarded the Medal of Honor for single-handedly engaging in hand-to-hand combat with a German raid while suffering 21 wounds. The Harlem Hellfighters were famous, known as an African American infantry unit that spent more time in combat than any other unit in World War I. They returned home to find out that whites still treated them with the same distaste as before. This led to the Red Summer of 1919, when anti-blacks and white supremacists launched terrorist attacks on African homes. That summer was marked with hundreds of casualties across the United States. On November 11, 1918, Germany had formally surrendered and all the nations agreed to withdraw from fighting. In a Paris summit, Germany and the Allies signed the Treaty of Versailles, which would officially end the war and punish Germany for starting it. President Wilson, on behalf of the U.S., imposed his 14 points, which was a statement of many principles of peace, as well as forming the League of Nations, an international organization whose goal was to keep world peace by settling disputes in various countries through negotiation and diplomacy. Though Henry Cabot Lodge of Congress rejected joining because it meant that the U.S. had to deal with more foreign wars, the Allies were declared the victors and Germany was declared loser. Germany owed a lot of money and land to France, however, they paid it off by inflating their currency immensely. The Treaty of Versailles proved not to be effective for world peace and the U.S. should not have approved it, as later, Germany was in economic collapse and began another world war. In the best interests of the Allies, it was wise for the U.S. to enter the war because if not, Germany would have been dominant and taken control over all of Europe as well, clogging the transatlantic trade. Benefits for the U.S. were that it helped boost world prestige among the nations and heavily increased the economy. Communism would have spread throughout Europe and the European allies would be no more, isolating the U.S. against all of Europe. If they had not joined, the United Nations would have never been created and the U.S. would not have become the #1 superpower in the world.